All right, welcome friends to the first podcast in our ecology series. Before we go too far, this is going to be an introduction to basic things that you should remember from first year studying ecology back in the ninth grade or whenever you studied it. And then we're going to go on to a little bit more in-depth topic of nutrient cycling. We'll worry about that later. First thing we need to do, though, is remember some terms that we should remember from a basic understanding of ecology. First of all, the levels of organization of living things. Let me real quick go to the next slide for a second. Levels of biological organization. We can organize and we can get we're the most basic level in this diagram, because this diagram is focusing on the big ecosystem type ideas that we will be talking about in this unit. But we can, this is starting with the smallest level of organization in life as being just one organism, one individual. And then we move on up to the level of population, where we're talking about a bunch of individuals of the same species in a particular area. Then we bump it up to the level of community, in which we're talking about not just one population of a species, but different species, populations of a bunch of different species, whether it's these pine trees or moose or cougar or owl or grasses or whatever, bunches of different species interacting together. And then we bump it up to a bigger level of organization still, where we talk about the ecosystem level of organization, where not only are we talking about all of the living things, but also the non-living components, the abiotic components of an ecosystem. For example, water, air, light, temperature, things of that nature. Then we bump it up to a bigger level still, called the biome, which is a region, like for example here shaded in blue would be the taiga biome, where you have coniferous or pine type forests and so on. We live in a temperate deciduous forest biome, a large area that has the same basic climate and precipitation, things like that. Okay? And then, of course, biosphere is everything that is living on planet Earth, the entire part of the Earth that supports life, I should say. So, these are the levels of biological organization. We can go smaller than the individual. We can go down to the level of cell and even get smaller than that. But a cell is the smallest thing we can have that is actually living. All of that said, hold on, let me go bump back up and make sure we've got these terms as well. We just mentioned biotic and abiotic. Biotic things are all the things living in an ecosystem. Abiotic are all those things that are non-living, like the water, the air, things like that. Habitat, where an organism lives. Niche, the role that the organism plays in its particular ecosystem, whether it's a predator, a prey item, whatever. Autotroph and heterotroph. You really need to know and be very comfortable with these two terms. An autotroph is an organism that makes its own food. It makes its own food, like a plant makes its own food by photosynthesis. A heterotroph is an organism that has to eat its food, eat its food to obtain organic compounds, to obtain nutrition. We'll talk more and more about these terms autotroph and heterotroph, but if you're not comfortable with them, please go and look into those, okay? And there will be a couple of little added videos that you can watch within the playlist on this podcast that shed light on some of these ideas. Photoautotrophs are organisms that make their own food using light. Chemoautotrophs are organisms that make their own food using inorganic chemicals, like elements that are coming up out of the earth, like at the deep sea vents. So we'll talk more about these, but you really can't emphasize this enough. You need to be comfortable with what the terms autotroph and heterotroph mean. Okay? All right, now, in an ecosystem, we are thinking about how two important factors are moved through and processed through the ecosystem, through the plants, through the animals, through the non-living parts of the ecosystem, the air, the soil, okay? Nutrients cycle through an ecosystem, meaning that, sorry, let me get my button back. Meaning that, like my picture there, okay? Nutrients are like these building blocks, all right? And I can use these blocks. I can put them together, okay? And I can build something with them. And these are exactly analogous to nutrients in an ecosystem. I can put them together and build this. But I can then take them apart, and I can use them to build something else that's maybe a little bit different, okay? Same over and over again. I can use these, build something, take them apart, build something else. This is exactly how nutrients work in an ecosystem. Only with nutrients, your building blocks, let's say, are in this soil that I got up out of the yard. And right now these nutrients are in the soil, but if I leave the soil back in the ground where I got it from, the nutrients in there will be taken up by all these plants that are all around. And then some animal may eat some leaves from these plants or some nuts that fall from these trees. And those nutrients that originated in the soil would then be in that animal. And then if that animal dies, he will lay down on the soil and die, his body will decay, and his nutrients will be returned back to the soil. The nutrients get recycled. They're here, they're in the plants, they go in the animals, they go back here, over and over and over again. Okay? And it is a very direct comparison between building blocks like you play with, Legos, and these atoms and molecules, nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and other elements. Okay? So, these cycles, these nutrient cycles that these different nutrients go through are called biogeochemical cycles, okay? Bio simply refers to they pass through living things. Geo, they pass through non-living things like the earth, the soil, and chemical, they're chemicals, okay? And they're also called nutrient cycles. There are a few that we're going to look at in detail. The carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, which you should already know, and the phosphorus cycle, okay? Now, nutrients, however, are not the only things that are in an ecosystem. If we are going to put these blocks together into a more complex form like this, I had to have energy to do that. These things didn't just put themselves together. There had to be energy put into assembling them into a more complex structure. Energy is what did that. Energy put these things together. I supplied the energy to do that. Energy put those things together. Okay? Now, the thing about energy is, what does it look like? You can't see it. I can't hold energy in my hand very easily. I know that it does things. Sometimes I can see it, like this light that is all around me is energy. But it is not a solid object like we think of with nutrients. Energy flows through an ecosystem. It is an ability to do work. It's not a thing. It's not stuff that you can hold. It is the ability to do work, or the action of the work being done, okay? Energy passes through an ecosystem. Once it is used, it's gone. Once this light is captured by a plant, it is converted to chemical energy and so on, but it's gone. We can't recapture that energy. It flows through the ecosystem. Or let's rephrase. Eventually, energy that, for example, comes from the sun gets converted to different forms, but eventually, once it's passed its course, it is in a form that is no longer usable to living things. So the energy, if you'll remember, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So the energy doesn't just disappear, but eventually it changes into a form that's not very useful. The energy goes into a plant, for example, and the plant uses it to make food, and then we eat the plant, and then we get energy from the plant that we ate, but then once we have moved our arms and legs, that energy is gone. It's gone to a form that can't really be recaptured by a living thing. Okay? So, just remember, bottom line, the Earth is getting a constant input of energy from the sun. Okay? Constant input of energy from the sun. Really, really important. The energy flows through the ecosystem. It is used while it's usable, but eventually we're going to hit a point where much of the the energy that we use gets dissipated to the environment in the form of heat energy, which is not very usable to living things. Nutrients, however, can be used over and over and over and over again. The molecules that are in you today could have been in a dinosaur millions of years ago. Nutrients on Earth that are here have always been here and will always be here. They're just getting cycled over and over and over again. Okay? Important nutrients, and there are many, many of them, but we are especially needing to be mindful of nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and water in terms of our nutrient cycles that we're going to study. Energy, we already mentioned, the ultimate source is the sun. So, now let's just focus on some nutrient cycles. Real quickly, the carbon cycle. Okay? The non-living part of the carbon cycle, the part where carbon is in place when it's not in a living thing, is in this atmosphere all around us. There is carbon dioxide, CO2, a small molecule, an inorganic form of carbon. We'll talk about those terms, organic and inorganic, but this is an inorganic, non-life-oriented form of carbon. Okay? Now, as carbon dioxide is, we cannot use it. I can breathe it in. I am breathing it in right now, and I exhale it right back out again. My body cannot use carbon dioxide. However, my body does need this carbon. I need it a lot. I need it to build my muscles, my skin, all of the compounds that make me a living thing. I need carbon as the foundation of those. And I'm swimming in it, but I can't use it by breathing it. However, this plant, can use carbon. It takes it in, and with the assistance of light and water, converts carbon to sugar, to glucose. He does it. It's called photosynthesis. It's as though it were magic, but it's not, and we'll talk about it. So this guy is going to convert this CO2 to sugar, and then, let's say that this guy eats this leaf from this plant. He is now taking that carbon that is now in this sugar molecule. This is the carbon source now, right here. The carbon got turned into sugar. Now he is eating it, and he is now getting the carbon he needs to build his tissues into his own body. Okay? Now, but it's a nutrient cycle. We have to get this carbon back up into the atmosphere, or eventually all the carbon would get locked up in the bodies of living things, and we couldn't use our building blocks over and over again. Eventually we'd run out. So when Mr. Bug sadly dies, his body will be decayed by bacteria, fungus, whatever, will begin to decay, and as a result of that decay, the carbon dioxide will be released back into the atmosphere to be used again. Now, this slide, this picture right here is reminding us that there are many other ways that CO2 can get into the atmosphere. One is by burning organic matter. You set it on fire, you are releasing this carbon that is locked up in these dead trees back into the atmosphere. We also, unfortunately, this photo is actually down at Dutch Gap. If you've ever been to Dutch Gap, there's a nice boat ramp down there. You can get access to the river, but right next to it is this great big power plant, the Virginia Power coal-fired power plant. And these are mountains of coal full of organic compounds, meaning there's lots of carbon in this coal. And carbon is a great energy source. They burn this carbon, it sends all this CO2 into the atmosphere. They try to do what they can to prevent too much carbon, but you still have to release carbon into the atmosphere, and so CO2 goes back into the atmosphere. Because of our burning of fossil fuels, we are putting a whole lot more of this into the atmosphere than would naturally be there, and some people are certainly more than concerned that this is contributing to global warming, and we'll talk about that more later. But let's not get lost in that now. What you need to know is CO2 is our inorganic form of carbon. This is our living form of carbon, sugar, that the plant makes. This guy eats it. Death is going to return this. Also, if he just exhales, that will also return the CO2 to the atmosphere. Okay? So that's your carbon cycle, basically. Now, the nitrogen cycle is a bit more complex, and I've never had a diagram that I like, so now you have this really lame diagram that I drew. I'm going to try to help you understand it. If you can't, let me just know in class. Now, nitrogen is written as N2, pure nitrogen gas as it exists, and we have piles of it in our atmosphere. In our atmosphere, more than 70% of our atmosphere is nitrogen gas. You're breathing it in, but you can't use it that way. You breathe it right back out again. N2 is inert. It will not be used. It doesn't like to react chemically. So what this means is you need nitrogen. You need tons of it. You need it to build proteins in your body. You need it to build DNA in your body. It's really an important chemical. You need it. But you can't get it by breathing it, even though it's everywhere. So here's how it works. This is where we start our little diagram. I'm going to put a number 1 there. Now, this is number 2. Okay? Nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is when this unusable nitrogen gas is taken by tiny bacteria that live associated with the roots of certain plants. They are called nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they are absolutely critical to our ecosystem, to our survival, because these are one of the few organisms on the planet that can take this unusable nitrogen and actually use it, and they can convert it into a form that plants and animals can use. So they take the nitrogen and convert it to a form that is usable by the plants. It then becomes part of the plant tissue, okay? So what they actually do is they, let me put this as number 3 down here. They convert it to a compound that normally we don't like very much. It's called ammonia. It's NH3. But ammonia can be used by the plant. The plant converts NH3, ammonia, to DNA, to proteins and stuff in its tissues. Well, and let me call this number 4 up here, and now we're going to move over here to number 5. The animal eats the plant's DNA, eats the plant proteins, and now this nitrogen that was part of their proteins is now part of this animal, okay? Now, the nitrogen, ammonia, whatever, is locked up in the animal. Well, it's not ammonia anymore, it's converted, but this nitrogen is now in the animal. So if this plant or this animal dies, we'll make this number 6, okay? Now decomposers are going to come in and start decomposing. There'll be fungus, there'll be bacteria, whatever. And they are going to change the DNA and the proteins back into ammonia. This is called ammonification. So these guys, and this will be number 7, are going to turn the body parts of these guys back into ammonia, NH3. Now, this ammonia, and I'm going to go do an 8 here, could be taken up by the plants again. So here's a 9. The plants take up the ammonia directly from the soil, and so we start the cycle all over again. Or this ammonia can get used, here's 9, by other bacteria in the soil called nitrifying bacteria. And what they do is they take this ammonia, that's really pretty nasty stuff, and they convert it into something called a nitrate, which is this, NO3, nitrate, or to other chemicals called nitrites, NO2. These things are useless to plants. Plants can take up nitrates, so this could actually go back up here to the plant and be used. NO2 cannot. So, NO2 would be a useless dead-end form of nitrogen if it weren't for denitrifying bacteria, which will take this useless NO2 and convert it back to nitrogen gas and then put that right back into the atmosphere where we originally got it. So, that is a scary-looking cycle. The most important things for you to remember about this cycle, I believe, are, first of all, that nitrogen gas, N2, is what's in the atmosphere and we cannot use it. And nitrogen-fixing bacteria are what make this usable to plants and animals. Those are the 2 most important things about this cycle. I can't say that you would never be asked about some parts of the rest of it, but if I had to pare it down to 2 things, those are the 2 things that I would focus on. Okay? Now, the phosphorus cycle is actually pretty straightforward. My slide's out of order, so let me go to the water cycle first, okay? We'll come back to this. The water cycle, straightforward. I'm not going to really do a lot with this because you should know it. Here's all of our sources of liquid water. We have water vapor in the air, water in lakes, water under the ground, water in the oceans. The water on the surface of the planet can go back up into the atmosphere in the form during evaporation and be in water vapor in the air. Again, this is especially important for us in biology. Transpiration is when plants take up water, which they are always doing, and then release it through their leaves, which they are also always doing. And in a forested area, this can be a very, very important source of putting water back up into the atmosphere. Runoff, as you probably are already aware, is where the water just runs off the land back into the surface water. Precipitation, of course, brings the water down from the evaporated water that occurred. Some of this water that precipitates down can actually percolate or go down and refill groundwater supplies and so on. I would have an understanding of this. I honestly haven't much seen it asked about. This is just a slide showing transpiration occurring, meaning that water is taken up at the roots, goes up a plant, and it actually comes out through the leaves, and we will talk about this later in more detail. It is extremely important for plants and for ecosystems that plants do this, okay? Transpiration can have a lot of really important ecosystem effects on water flow, and in particular on how nutrients cycle, whether nutrients get lost from soil or if they get held back in the soil and put up into the plants and so on. So really, really an important concept. Indeed, we can see in this graph that if you strip an area of forest, at the point where the they're following nitrogen compounds here in milligrams per liter, and what we see is after the deforestation, the amount of nitrate lost to runoff in the surface water is huge. Here it is reasonably stable. We can see that it cycles a bit, but that the amount of nitrogen in the runoff water running off the land was pretty stable, and it just skyrockets when you don't have trees there to hold in the soil. So when you increase the runoff off the land by getting rid of trees, you lose a lot. Besides just water, you lose a lot of nutrients from the ecosystem as well in the form of runoff. Okay. Phosphorus cycle. I guess I just didn't. I guess I was going to just hand draw this in. So essentially, you have the element phosphorus tied up in the rocks. Okay. And as the rocks erode, as the rain comes down on the rocks, we loosen up, we dissolve some of this phosphorus, and then the plants then take it up once it's eroded, and then of course animals eat plants and we get phosphorus. When the plants and animals die, it goes back into the soil, and then the cycle starts all over again. So the phosphorus cycle is really pretty simple. The phosphorus starts out in rocks. It erodes due to rain and weathering. Plants take it up. Animals eat it. Animals and plants die. It goes back into the soil and is taken up over and over again. Okay? Of course, if you have lots of runoff, then you can lose phosphorus into bodies of water like that, which is not a good thing. All right. Finally, nutrients as limiting factors. There are populations in an ecosystem could theoretically just keep multiplying and multiplying and multiplying, reproducing, but they don't. And that's because eventually you run out of food, you run out of something, you run out of space. Well, sometimes you could run out of a nutrient. Nutrients can act as limiting factors, limiting how rapidly population or a community can grow in an ecosystem. So, nutrient availability, how many nutrients, carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, whatever, are available is a really important factor that determines how productive an ecosystem can be, how much life can an ecosystem support. That is this term productivity. That's what it means, how much life can an ecosystem support. Can you have too much of a nutrient? Can you have too much of a nutrient? Really? I mean, I would think not. You need nutrients, so the more the better. Well, not so much. In this water, for example, a lot of nutrient was run off due to human activity, and as a result, you have tons of algae growth. When you have a lot of algae growth, you eventually have a lot of algae death. It gets so thick at the top that the light can't penetrate to where there's algae underneath. The algae dies in massive amounts. Death of large amounts of algae due to the decay process that bacteria go through when they're killing off all this algae, when they're eating the dead, decomposed algae rather. They consume oxygen. So the bacteria that are decomposing dead algae will consume oxygen. As they do so, they suck all the oxygen out of the water, and then you end up with enormous fish kill situations like this one, okay? And that's a dead zone. There's no oxygen. There is no O2 in this, for all intents and purposes. There's no O2 in this water, and the organisms that need it can't survive, and they literally suffocate. This process, where too much of a nutrient causes a big algae bloom, and then a big algae death, and then a big fish death, is called eutrophication. It is too much, caused by too much nutrient in the water. Okay? And there I could have just let my little notes do that. Okay? So, excess nutrients lead to algae blooms, decay of the algae by bacteria, and then oxygen depletion of the water. Okay. What you see here is an image, this was back in '08, but there's a huge dead zone that appears in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. Here we are, right here. Here's Richmond, here's Norfolk down here, the Chesapeake Bay, running on up into Maryland. The red indicates basically no oxygen, and it's a huge area. And of course the yellow is not so great either, and it's due to exactly this eutrophication, runoff of nutrients from farm fields, due to fertilizer, people's lawns, due to excess fertilizer being put down and so on, fertilizes the bay, the algae grows, and then you get this eutrophication problem. Okay, that's it for this podcast. Please come to school with any questions you might have. Thanks for watching.